All right, we've got a bunch of stuff to cover tonight. First, the former president of the United States is going to be sentenced for 34 felony convictions next week on Thursday. The prosecutors who brought that case and who prosecuted in court that case against Donald Trump, they were due today to make their sentencing recommendation to the judge. In a New York State case like this, it's not the jury that convicted Trump that will decide what his sentence is. It's the judge who oversaw the case. It's Judge Juan Merchan who will sentence Trump. The maximum sentence under law that Trump could face is 4 years in prison. It's very possible, however, that he might not get any prison time at all, or if he does get a sentence of confinement, it's possible it could be home confinement. We just don't know. On the one hand, what he's been convicted of, while it is 34 felonies, it's a nonviolent crime. And also, he's a first-time offender. He's never been convicted of anything before. Those would certainly cut against him getting any significant jail time. On the other hand, he does have 3 other major felony criminal cases pending against him at this moment. He was fined by this judge for multiple violations of the court order in this case that required him to restrain himself from speaking about jurors and witnesses and court staff and the families of the judge and the lawyers in this case. He's also shown absolutely no remorse whatsoever, which is the thing that judges are supposed to consider. So all of those factors serve as sort of aggravating context. Those might cut in favor of him getting jail time. Who knows? This is why a person with the job title judge makes a decision like this and not randos like you or me. Before the sentencing, the judge will get 3 pieces of advice, essentially, to help him make his decision. He will get a not public-facing, confidential recommendation on Trump's proposed sentence from the probation department. He will also get a sentencing recommendation from Trump's own lawyers, which presumably will be that he should get a cookie and a nice bag of treats because he's a good boy. And presumably he will also get the sentencing recommendation from prosecutors as well. There is no rule about whether or not the prosecutor's sentencing recommendation is made public, either before the sentencing or during the sentencing or after. That is all up to Judge Merchan as to whether he tells us what the prosecutors are asking for. But I can also tell you tonight that it is not totally clear when the judge is going to get that sentencing recommendation from prosecutors. It was due in today, but then something happened today. Immediately following today's seismic Supreme Court ruling on presidential immunity, Trump's lawyers advised the judge in the New York criminal case that they are going to ask him formally, they're going to file a motion asking him essentially to set aside Trump's guilty verdict, despite the jury's verdict in that case. After Trump's lawyers notified the judge that they were going to ask him to set aside the verdict, prosecutors then didn't send in their sentencing recommendations as they had been expected to do. Now, as far as we know, the sentencing is still on. But there is an element of uncertainty now as to what kind of a hitch this might be in finishing up this criminal case in which Trump has already been convicted. We can report tonight that Trump's lawyers have asked that the sentencing itself be delayed. And we expect that Judge Merchan will consider delaying the sentence after he gets both that request from Trump's lawyers, but also after he hears from the prosecutors on that matter. Now that prosecutors have delayed submitting their sentencing recommendations, does that mean the sentencing itself will be delayed? Does that mean anything else material in terms of the sentence that Trump will likely face or when he will hear about it? We don't know. We are waiting to hear from Judge Merchan. As we await Trump's sentencing in that case, this immunity ruling today from the Supreme Court is at hand. And I'm not a lawyer. It is, as far as I can tell, in my layman's understanding, it is as radical as anything I have ever seen from the United States Supreme Court. I can certainly tell you that it is profoundly worse. It is a profoundly worse ruling than even the most pessimistic observers predicted. There was essentially one substantial aspect of immunity for Trump that Trump and his lawyers put to the court that they did not get. That was this sort of internally contradictory, confusing proposal they'd made that a president can only be criminally prosecuted for crimes if you first impeached him in the House and convicted him in the Senate. The implication was that any failed impeachment effort would effectively immunize that behavior for life. That thing about impeachment being connected in that way to a criminal prosecution, the court threw that out as nonsense. But they gave him everything else he asked for and more. They gave him immunity in every other way that he asked for it, including for things his own lawyer conceded weren't among Trump's official acts as president. Things that Trump's lawyer conceded were private acts were described in today's majority ruling as things for which Trump might nevertheless potentially get immunity. Here's how Justice Sonia Sotomayor put it in her dissent today. She said that the court, quote, refuses to designate any course of conduct alleged in the indictment as private, despite concessions from Trump's counsel. She continues, when asked about allegations that private actors helped implement a plan to submit fraudulent slates of presidential electors to obstruct the certification proceeding, and Trump and a co-conspirator attorney directed that effort, Trump's counsel conceded the alleged conduct by Trump was private. She then says, quote, only the majority, meaning only the majority ruling in the court today, thinks that organizing fraudulent slates of electors might qualify as an official act of the president. In other words, Trump may be even more protected from prosecution on the fake electors thing than even Trump asked for. Justice Sotomayor's dissent is being cited widely today, not only because of its heat, it is considerably hot, but also because of the light that it sheds on the practical consequences of this ruling from the majority. She says, quote, looking beyond the fate of this particular prosecution, the long-term consequences of today's decision are stark. The court effectively creates a law-free zone around the president, upsetting the status quo that has existed since the founding. This new official acts immunity now lies about like a loaded weapon for any president that wishes to place his own interests, his own political survival, or his own financial gain above the interests of the nation. The president of the United States is the most powerful person in the country and possibly the world. When he uses his official powers in any way under the majority's reasoning, he now will be insulated from criminal prosecution. Orders the Navy's SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival? Immune. Organizes a military coup to hold on to power? Immune. Takes a bribe in exchange for a pardon? Immune. Immune, immune, immune. Let the president violate the law. Let him exploit the trappings of his office for personal gain. Let him use his official power for evil ends. Because if he knew that he may one day face liability for breaking the law, he might not be as bold and fearless as we would like him to be. That's the majority's message today. Even if these nightmare scenarios never play out, and I pray they never do, the damage has been done. The relationship between the president and the people he serves has shifted irrevocably. In every use of official power, the president is now a king above the law. She closes, quote, never in the history of our republic has a president had reason to believe that he would be immune from criminal prosecution if he used the trappings of his office to violate the criminal law. Moving forward, however, all former presidents will be cloaked in such immunity. If the occupant of that office misuses official power for personal gain, the criminal law that the rest of us must abide will not provide a backstop. She says, quote, with fear for our democracy, I dissent. Justice Sotomayor's dissent was joined today by Justice Kagan and Justice Jackson. The three of them, and through Justice Sotomayor's writing this dissent, they have at least done us the favor of writing what's kind of a speaking dissent. It spells out, not in legalese, but in plain English, the stark consequences of this ruling today. To his credit, actually, President Biden did the same tonight at the White House. He said, quote, today's decision almost certainly means there's no limits to what a president can do. This is a fundamentally new principle, and it's a dangerous precedent. The power of the office will no longer be constrained by the law, even the Supreme Court of the United States. The only limits will be self-imposed by the president alone. But there are two practical consequences of this ruling that I feel like I need help in understanding tonight. I am worried about both of them, I have to tell you, but I feel like I need expert advice in terms of understanding what they really mean. And so I'm going to ask for some help on two things in particular. The first is this, which is not from the dissent, but from the actual ruling. It's talking about the part of the federal indictment against Trump for the overthrowing the government stuff, for the January 6th stuff, the part of the indictment that relates to him trying to use the Justice Department, trying to employ the Justice Department basically as a tool in his scheme to overthrow the government and hold on to power after he lost the election. On that point specifically, the ruling says this, quote, "The indictment's allegations that the requested investigations were shams or proposed for an improper purpose do not divest the president of exclusive authority over the investigative and prosecutorial functions of the Justice Department and its officials. Because the president cannot be prosecuted for conduct within his exclusive constitutional authority, Trump is absolutely immune from prosecution for the alleged conduct involving his discussions with Justice Department officials." Absolutely immune from anything related to his discussions with Justice Department officials. My question is, doesn't that mean the president, any president here, is being given overt carte blanche from the court that he or she can tell the Justice Department to do anything for any reason, and it can never be reviewed for the life of that president? Because if so, among other things, Richard Nixon would like his presidency back, please. If everything that happens between a president and his Justice Department is absolutely immune from the criminal law, is absolutely immune from not only the prosecution but investigation by the courts as a potentially criminal matter, that means that the president can do things with the Justice Department that, I mean, what's the limit? My second question is about what happens next in that federal case referenced there about January 6th. The justices in the majority today, with Chief Justice Roberts writing for them, said explicitly that they want portions of this case sent back to the district court. So not the part that relates to Trump talking to Justice Department officials, but the other parts of it. They want those parts of the indictment sent back to the district court, meaning back to Judge Tanya Chutkan's courtroom in Washington, D.C., essentially for her to determine in her courtroom whether or not Trump's actions, as described in the indictment, were official and therefore immune, or were they not official, which might mean that charges on those matters can go ahead. What does that mean exactly? What are the justices saying should happen in Judge Chutkan's courtroom? And when? And what will that look like to an American public that really is actively considering right now whether to send this particular felon back to the White House, thanks to the Republican Party of the United States?
I concur with Justice Sotomayor's dissent today. Here's what she said. She said, in every use of official power, the president is now a king above the law. With fear for our democracy, I dissent. End of quote. So should the American people dissent. I dissent.
President Biden tonight at the White House responding to the Supreme Court's ruling that hands presidents, including himself, absolute immunity from prosecution for anything they can successfully argue was an official act. The president name-checked Justice Sonia Sotomayor's blistering dissent, which she delivered from the bench at the court today. That dissent started, quote, "Today's decision to grant former presidents criminal immunity reshapes the institution of the presidency. It makes a mockery of the principle foundational to our Constitution and system of government that no man is above the law. Relying on little more than its own misguided wisdom about the need for bold and unhesitating action by the president, the court gives former President Trump all the immunity he asked for and more." She said, quote, "Because our Constitution does not shield a former president from answering for criminal and treasonous acts, I dissent." And then she laid out the basis for her dissent. Normally, when Supreme Court justices dissent, they use the word respectfully, saying, "I respectfully dissent." Today, Justice Sotomayor and also Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson each struck the word respectfully and just wrote, "I dissent." And that is the kind of reaction we are seeing from legal scholars and experts everywhere today. NPR's veteran legal correspondent Nina Totenberg just telling us moments ago that legal observers and experts, including what she described as sort of the both sides of the aisle, meaning both sides of the ideological number line, were, in her words, astonished by how radical this ruling was today. Sherrilyn Ifill, the former president and director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, she responded to the ruling today by saying this. She said, quote, "Today's decision in Trump versus United States is a grotesque and hideous distortion of the rule of law by a majority of the highest court of the most powerful democracy in the world. The national and global implications of upending this core principle of democracy has potentially catastrophic national and global implications." Catastrophic. Joining us now is Sherrilyn Ifill. She is now the Vernon E. Jordan Jr. Distinguished Chair in Civil Rights at Howard Law School. Ms. Ifill, it makes me happy to see your face. I'm really glad that you could be here tonight of all nights. Thank you for making the time.
Of course.
So Justice Roberts criticized the liberal justices' dissent today, said they were striking a tone of chilling doom, essentially saying, calm down, ladies, accusing them of overreacting and of portraying this ruling's consequences as something that they are not. You clearly think the consequences of this ruling are, in your words, potentially catastrophic. Can you explain why you think so?
Yeah, I do. Thank you so much, Rachel, for having me. That was part of what was so disturbing about Chief Justice Roberts' opinion. You know, if you're going to burn the house down, don't be mad that people call it arson. You know, this decision is, I talked about it being, you know, having catastrophic consequences because precisely of what Justice Sotomayor says about the rule of law. There is no question about what the rule of law means. It means that the law applies equally to all, rich and poor, highborn and lowborn, black, white, Latino. It means that that one principle of law applies to everyone equally. And the president, once he is no longer a president, is a citizen of the United States. And therefore, the presumption is that he is covered as well by the rule of law. To shatter that today is so incredibly shocking that I think many people are back on their heels. And I say that it has global implications because our country is a tremendously influential country because of our power, because of our history, because of our national identity that we have worked so hard to press to other nations. We have held ourselves up as an exemplar of democracy. And for the highest court in our land to send a signal, not only to those in this country, but to the rest of the world, that the rule of law is something that can be interrupted for a president of your same political party is incredibly dangerous. And the worst part of it, Rachel, is this is not a theoretical conversation. We actually have experience with former President Trump. We know what he is capable of. We know the kind of excesses that he would like to and did engage in as president. So this is not a case in which the court did not have before it the evidence of someone who would dangerously use the power that they so recklessly put in the hands of any president today.
I was interested in the way that Justice Sotomayor in her dissent kept going back to the particularities of the indictment and Trump's conduct, as if to say, this is not a theoretical matter. This is not something that we are describing or deciding in the abstract. I think making that exact point implicitly. Let me ask you about a very dark potential consequence of this, and this, again, was raised explicitly by Justice Sotomayor. The implications of the hypothetical assassination scenario. You know, let's say a president ordered an element of the military to carry out an attack on somebody who he saw as a danger or as a political rival. The justices seem to have made clear that if the order to kill the person could be construed as something that was official, that the immunity matter is settled, and that would actually be something for which a president could never be prosecuted. Is it that simple? I mean, how would that actually work in the legal system?
You know, it seems impossible to imagine that that could be what they mean, although the plain reading of what they wrote, that is what they mean. And we have a former president who, you'll remember, asked his defense secretary why they couldn't just shoot protesters, Black Lives Matter protesters, in the legs. This is someone who actually thinks in that way. Now, one of the things that held Trump back when he was president was that very often the people around him would not carry out the things he asked them to do. He asked his White House counsel over and over again to fire Jeff Sessions, and he wouldn't do it. He constantly asked people to do things, and they would ignore him, knowing that he wouldn't do it himself. He wouldn't do it himself because he was at that time unsure of his liability. Now he is sure that this Supreme Court thinks he would have no liability. So first of all, we have a category of things he can do himself. He can strip military members from their ranks for not following his orders. He can accept cash bribes for pardons. There's a whole bunch of things he can do. But then he also can order others to do things. And the people that he's going to have, if he is elected in his cabinet in his second round, are going to be people of considerably less restraint than those he had the first time around, and they were not particularly restrained. So what this court has opened up to us is a true danger. It has unleashed the full power of someone who has shown themselves to be utterly unfit to lead this country, someone who has no regard for restraint or ethics. And the fact that you can litigate it later, the fact that you can, return to the district court, or that you can address these matters in a lower court to make their way back up to the Supreme Court won't change the fact that people will be harmed, that people can be harmed, and that our systems of government and that the rule of law can be even further degraded. Somewhere along the way, there are a majority of justices on this court who decided that they needed to be the last word on everything, that they could no longer trust the apparatus of democracy. They could no longer trust federal agencies, thus overturning Chevron. They could no longer trust women to make decisions about their bodies. They could no longer trust university officials to decide how to build their classes. And they could no longer trust the political system to decide fairly how to pick their representatives, so they couldn't interfere with partisan gerrymandering. Now they've decided that determining whether or not the law covers the president of the United States and how much it does and when it does and when it doesn't is fully in their hands. And they have just cut a wide swath of the president's actions, powers, official and unofficial, that they have deemed barred from criminal prosecution. It's stunning. And I hope people understand how significant this is, how much this day is one that will be remembered as one that has very serious consequences for our understanding of the rule of law in this country. We had better wake up and understand the consequences of this election and understand the consequences of having allowed a Supreme Court to have this kind of power in which they believe they cannot be checked by any level of government in our society, and not trust the American people to make decisions for themselves. I'm so alarmed. I'm so disturbed. But I would say I feel also a sense of resolve. I think they have fully shown themselves. This court has played its hand. Anyone pretending that we don't know what's going on with this court is doing that, is pretending. And I think we now have to get very serious about what it means. We are allowed to protect our democracy, and we have to do so. We have to do so at the ballot box. And then once we prevail in elections, we have to make real decisions about what we want to do to ensure the Supreme Court is ethical, that the Supreme Court is acting in a way that is democratic, and we have to pass laws that will close all of these loopholes that have been left open because we had the temerity to believe that norms and ethics would guard us against certain kinds of conduct. That has not proven to be true, and so we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah, and in the very near term, in 4 months, we will be making a decision about who should be in the Oval Office holding what is now effectively unlimited and tyrannical power, and what kind of person ought to be entrusted with that, which nobody should ever be entrusted with, but now that's what we have. Sherrilyn Ifill, now at Howard Law School. Again, seeing you here is a comfort to me because I trust you and I believe in you.
Same to me.
And I am grateful for your wisdom tonight. Thank you.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.